The DF trigger component is used to control trigger events when a game object enters, stands, or exits the trigger collider, trigger type, enter. Or when a player looks at a trigger, trigger type, look, using the DFFPS trigger activator component, which we will look at later. Let's consider it in more detail. Is show description, if toggle is on, show text field to describe this component. Trigger type, the trigger can be of two types, enter or look, which we will look at later. Is use action key, if toggle is on, the on-stay event will only be called when the button is pressed. This button is used to display the DF Manager input window where you can add, remove or edit its elements. The DF Manager input window we will look at later. Collider, the collider for tracking collisions of game objects in this trigger. Disable after exit, if toggle is on, disable DF trigger, when the object exits the collider. Is use tag, if toggle is on, collision tracking will only be performed for game objects with this tag. Is show gizmo, if toggle is on, show collider gizmo. Is stay once, if toggle is on, the event on stay will be called only once. Consider the types of the triggers. Trigger type, enter, monitors when a game object enters, stands, or exits the trigger collider and calls the appropriate events. On enter, the event will be called when the game object enters the trigger collider. On stay, the event will be called when the game object is in the trigger collider. On exit, the event will be called when the game object exits the trigger collider. Trigger type, look, monitors when the player looks at the trigger using the DFFPS trigger activator component and calls the on-look event when the use button is clicked, which is assigned in the DFFPS trigger activator component. On look, the event will be called when the player looks at a trigger using a component DFFPS trigger activator. For use in events, called methods. Trigger enable, bool is enable or disable the DF trigger component of the current game object, is enable is true, will be enabled and vice versa. Trigger enable invert, enable or disable the DF trigger component of the current game object, was enabled, disable and vice versa.